It's interesting with a shot like this, like when you look back, it just makes sense how to do it, or like you can think of 5 different ways of doing it. But before you start, it's just like this big, intimidating canvas, and you don't even know where to start.
All right, so Jorge, one of the really cool things about this particular piece is the way that 3D gets used. And sometimes looking at it, I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure that is actually 3D, but sometimes maybe it's fake 3D, and it's really hard to tell. And that's like, I think one of the coolest things about this. So for this section, why don't we just walk through some of those specific moments? And I thought we could start with the sort of totem moment, like the big hero shot of the students kind of leaning back on, on the donuts, if you will.
Yeah, so that's a monster shot. And first of all, like everything I'm about to show you, this is pretty much all created by School of Motion alumni Deanna Riley. So I'm, again, putting myself in her shoes, trying to show you this stuff. But we knew that we wanted to have like some fully 3D shots, especially kind of like in this part where we're like, it's just before the computer opens and we're revealing this world of opportunities, if you will. And when we designed this shot, we knew that it was going to be heavy 3D, heavy cinema, but obviously we wanted to have a lot of unexpected elements and a lot of 2D elements so that everything felt cohesive and together. So, I mean, we've talked a little bit about this with design, but like the base was that even from the design phase, we're thinking about how this can feel in 3D. So yeah, we have these shots already built in Cinema from the design phase. And these are the ones that Nuria rendered just as a wireframe, basically, that she brought into Photoshop to color. So we had a starting point that we knew we could maybe use or maybe just recreate. And a lot of these things were done very quickly just for reference. So it's not usable material. For example, this has the holes and it's just bad geometry. So we can't necessarily use it all, but at least it gives us an idea of how things were built and what things were thought to be 3D from the beginning. So that's kind of like our starting point based on the design files. So this is kind of the ones that I was talking about, like let's start with things that you can chew on. And initially the very beginning was, okay, let's find ways to bring in this all elements together first. Like imagine this without textures. This is kind of how it all started, just animating shapes on top of each other. And then the characters came at the very, very end. But it was more like, how are we gonna go from the frame that she had to the next part of the totem pole and then onto the top part? The idea was that, we're going upwards, but because the designs were not necessarily built that way, like we had to find clever ways to animate this cylinder from here up there, or where's the circle come from, what happens to this big semicircle, and so on. So this is where we started. Like this is pretty much day one for her. It was like, we're not even focusing on the camera movements. Like we're doing a pan, but this is not the right perspective. It's just like, is this a right way of thinking how elements come in and animate it out? And some of them felt a bit too bouncy. So we're like, okay, maybe we can clean them up a little bit. And then, okay, now that we have the base, how does it look with the camera? And here you can actually see that she used the actual Cinema elements that Nuria had originally done. So like she's not starting from scratch. But yeah, basic, forget about the textures right now. Let's start where we can. And here we're like, okay, what are the characters are gonna look like? And she made really basic, smart decisions. Like the limbs, like first think what the character needs to do. Like, do we even need to rig the character? Like, is it gonna be a crazy movement, or is it something that it can be like a very simple limb that we can get away with? And the answer is like, we don't have to rig the whole character. Like their movements are so basic that we can just do just what we need. Like, let's not spend 2 days rigging a character that it's only gonna move its leg once. So in the end, there is some kind of basic rigging, but yeah, it's basically, basic parenting. There's not, like in other sections, we use bendy limbs from EJ for like the running and like the real movements. But here, the movement is so basic, like this is considered a rig, but it's just such a simple rig. Oh yeah, so this is our first attempt to comping. So here, Dina is adding some of the textures from Photoshop and putting some reflections from Cinema and see how things look. And it's actually not too far. It's gonna work. So this is the first moment that we're like, okay, this might actually work, which is great feeling because before that it's just terrifying.
And we're kind of obsessed with doing it well. Our teachers aren't just skilled working professionals. They're also the top motion design experts in the industry.
Here's the first test at comping. And you can see like the cylinders look very, very different. And in some ways, when I show you the After Effects file, we just grab the texture from the Photoshop file and put it on top of the cylinder and scale it and move it and scale it like almost frame by frame in some parts just to keep that texture looking right, even though the underlying shape was 3D. And we do that more than we would like to admit. Like we just fake it, put stuff on top and frame by frame it so it feels right.
So what did the raw render, I guess when we get into After Effects, we'll see it, but I'm curious what the raw render looked like and how many passes you used and stuff.
It's interesting when a shot like this, like when you look back, it just makes sense how to do it. Or like you can think of 5 different ways of doing it. But before you start, it's just like this big intimidating canvas and you don't even know where to start. So in a way, this is the base.
Oh, wow, look at that. So like the technique to get this was kind of what you were showing earlier, Jorge. Like you had some gradient textures that were reflective, probably blurry reflections, and then some lights to kind of give it some interactive stuff.
Exactly. And here it's like the passes are a little bit comped already. So you can see the reflection and the ambient, like we're adding, like maybe duplicating the ambient a couple times to get that feel, or how strong will the shadow be? What level should we be using in terms of opacity? Like should everything be 100%? This is your base render. And as you can see, the 2D stuff, we're just rendering flat. Like it's just the material. There's no, it's not like it's done in After Effects. It's just coming straight from Cinema, but we're just making them look flat. And then there's not even a body because we knew that we wanted to do that in After Effects with shapes and strokes. So once we have that, this base layers were used for each individual comp. So this is one element, right? We have our base render, which doesn't look like much. It's very basic. And then we're starting to add the different layers to make it look right. So this is just a matte of one side. And once we have the definition of what that one side looks like, we can grab this, which is an actual layer from the Photoshop file, as the actual side look. So if I were to move this, you can see that this is just the texture, put it in there. And one thing that was hugely useful was just the 3D nulls, so that we can grab the 3D nulls for that specific side and we can just put a flat texture on that side, matte it, and then we have the exact look that we want. Now duplicate that 6 times to do every side, and then add reflections, bring in some of the mattes, like the shade on the top, the luminance, and then you have your final texture shape that went from something like this to this. And how much of the 3D was used, it kind of depends on each shape, but a lot of the time it's like, okay, if we want to make this to look the way we want to look, we just know our limitations with Cinema. Let's do it the way we know. And in this case let's almost color each side individually. And I'm sure if you were to give this to an expert 3D renderer, maybe they could have done everything to look exactly in Cinema. But again, like it kind of depends on your limitations as well.
I think one thing I want to call out about that, Jorge, is that it sounds like if you describe that process out of context, it sounds insane, because it's like so much extra work. And now I know why you did it though, because looking at the way that cube ended up looking, I think it would have been much harder to get that exact look in Cinema 4D. But my question is, why was it so important for you to have that much control, to be that precise? Like, wouldn't it have been okay if it was like close to the boards, or Or was that, because I'm sure people watching this are wondering like, oh my God, is that what it's like to freelance for ordinary folk?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big thing. It was like, and Victor says this all the time, and we make fun of it. It's like, respect the art, not the artist. But which is a total joke. But like in the sense, it's like respect the art as much as you can. Like you work with a designer that put a lot of thought and effort into every single little gradient and line into that Photoshop file. The same way that you put effort into little keyframes that you do and animate, like. It's important to respect the decisions that were made before it got to you. So that's one. And the other one is because when we define, like when we're working on animatics and the flow, it's, we're working with the final designs when we put them all together. And when there is like slight differences between shots, like very often we'll put this render, like we'll put the style frame on top of the render just to compare. Because sometimes we were like, there's something missing about this shot that doesn't feel right. There's something off. And sometimes it's just like the reds are different or like the yellow got messed up because after you did all the comping. And little things like that, it was like, then we can adjust individually to make it look like the style frame. But I think the answer is like, we want to respect the art as much as possible. And I think in our minds, at least, it's these little things that can make it look unique. And because it wasn't fully done in Photoshop or not in cinema, because there were all these little tricks, those are the little things that you're like, oh, like I wonder how they made it look like that. Like, I mean, it might be a foolish way of looking at it, and it's maybe not practical, but like we think like it makes a difference.
I think that's beautiful. I love that. All right, so what else can we learn from this shot? I mean, I think that was kind of a big revelation for me, just seeing how much 2D parenting to, nulls you brought in and using, object buffers and all of that. And so now you can really just almost frame by frame manually create exactly the look you want, but you have the 3D geometry to work with. So what are some of the other things you had to do for this shot?
Yeah, I think one good one will be to see how the characters were done, which in some ways follow that same rule. One thing that is cool about this character is that the body is really just lines in After Effects. Like we really have this chest outline, which is a very 2D outline of the chest that we just linked it to a 3D null for the body. So it matches, but there's no 3D at all in it. And it's really, really basic. But when in context with everything else, your brain doesn't even think that it's not 3D or that it's not in the same world because everything just fits together. And you can see a lot of tricks here, like a lot of this stuff doesn't really match. The shadows are all over the place. But again, when it's comped and when it's everything in place, you don't really notice that stuff yet. You just feel it, right? And the way that Dina solved the whole 2D, 3D, she rendered the limbs in 3D, and then she just faded the passes on top of one. And I believe there was even some cell animation to get some specific shapes of the legs.
So like on the bent leg, there's a reflection pass getting that highlight, and she's just feathering that off so it's not on the straight leg?
Yeah, virtually.
That's really clever. I love it.
So she's using this render as a base and then turning off on the layers for the parts that we want the reflection and the luminance, refraction and so on. So yeah, it's really cool to, like, even for me, like when I'm directing an animator or whatever, I rarely will go into their After Effects file. Sometimes I will, just to kind of like see what things are working or where they have a question or a suggestion. But it's very interesting for me to see, like, say I gave a bunch of notes or we talked about a bunch of things that we could solve together, how it was solved behind the curtain. So because it's not like I know exactly, or like my job is not to tell them exactly how to solve a problem. It's kind of like, like this is not working. Here's an idea of how you can solve it. But they might say, oh, or we can do this. And it's like, oh yeah, that's better. But at the end, I'm not necessarily focused on the technicalities as an art director or as a creative director. I'm focused on how can we make this look like the way it's supposed to look. So to your point of like, well, is it okay if it doesn't look exactly like style frame? Like for me, in some ways, this is already outside my comfort zone of how different it looks. Like we fixed the levels in some ways to make it, like the blues obviously don't match, but like just the spheres, we didn't made it look as exactly as Nuria had. Like there are certain reflections that Nuria had that just were so sharp and clean that we couldn't get it that way. So like it's already like pushing to my comfort zone of how different it looks. And I just wanted to mention that, but sometimes you just gotta live with that,
That's so funny. And it's also funny because like nobody except for you and maybe Nuria would ever know. But maybe even Nuria wouldn't even have noticed, She's moved on. All right, so let's dive into this shot. What are we looking at here? This was another one when I saw it. I was like, I have no clue how this was done.
Yeah, so this was probably my favorite shot to animate for a few reasons. One is 24 frames. And two is like, there's just so much going on that you won't ever have the time to see everything that goes on. You'll be able to just feel it. And I kind of love those kind of shots because you can't really focus too much on the technicalities or like big rigs or whatever. Like you just need to make sure that it flows well. And then the other one is like, there's just so many different layers. It's like, there's just a million ways to create this. And I really wanted to like, just find an interesting way to build this shot. So I've shown you the Photoshop file before, which I use very little. But one thing I really wanted to do is like, I want this background to be alive. Like, I don't want it to be just like the shapes are here and then that's the frame. Like, so in a way, the first thing I wanted to do was how are we gonna build the background? So first thing I did is like a bunch of shapes, like let's just put them all on top of each other. So we have black solid, that's a base. Then we have the left, which is one side. Then we have this one, which is gonna cut in the middle and create 1, 2, 3 shapes. And I have them here in difference mode just to create different layers and see them clearly. Then we have the big circle, or half circle rather, that is gonna create like 3 more. So all of a sudden we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 shapes. Then we have a null that rotates everything. That doesn't really do anything. And then we have the circle. And now all of a sudden we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 different shapes created just by difference. And this is our base. Now I can animate this. I have a rotator that I can, rotate these two ones and I can control those. And every time they overlap, because of the difference, they create different colors. I also have a rotator for the main circle. Every time I move this one, it would also create different shades. So this is the base movement. And as you can see, is 6 keyframes. Well, duplicated a couple times, but this is it. Like that's the base movement. And those are the base curves that I'm gonna use for every single piece of the animation in this shot. So this speed here and this speed here and this speed here will be the same throughout the piece. So every element is gonna start slow, it's gonna end, well, it's gonna start fast, middle slow, and end fast. So once I had this movement ready, which took a few options because I didn't really know exactly what was gonna feel. Like if I just show this, it's not really that amazing. And the initial animation I have for this background, which I don't know if I ever render it, but it was like a lot more complicated. And when I used it with the shapes on top, it was like just like a vomit of stuff happening on top. And I was like, okay, I gotta simplify that background because otherwise it's already such a fast shot, this is not gonna work. So once I had the background, then I can start stylizing each shade, each part. And the way I did is really just grab the actual mask of all the shapes. So I have, the render, and I'm just using a linear key, keying this specific shade, and that's gonna be my matte. So when I add the texture to it, which is really just a circle with a gradient on top and a bunch of scatters, like there's nothing genius about this. Again, same speed for these keyframes.
Dude, I love that trick. That is awesome. Let me ask you really quickly about something I'm noticing in your timeline. You have some layers set to, it looks like draft mode, and some are set to full quality. What's the logic there?
Yeah, so I noticed that linear color key is pretty bad. And I tried Keylight, but it wasn't specific enough. So when I was doing that, I noticed that it created some funny edges in the final result when it was trying to soften it, which created a little edge in all the keys.
Yeah, it was aliasing it, yeah.
Exactly. So when I hardened it, what I did after it to soften is I just added a blur on top to soften it a bit. So some of the backgrounds were like just a purple one, so that one wasn't a big deal. For this one, is really just the shape moving up. Like that's my texture animated. Again, this is all recreated in After Effects. And many ways, I'll bring the Photoshop layer as a reference and I'll just mask the part I need to make sure it's matching. So here we have a bunch. So we have some of the elements animating here. Then this one. So here is my Photoshop layer. And this is what it's supposed to look like. So I just created a little wiggle shape that is moving. That's it. That's my texture for that. And then there's a dark blue. So, okay, here's like basically all the layers animated for the background. And then the next thing is the shapes. So for the shape, I did a kind of like similar approach. I had one master comp with all the shapes. Like forget about masking right now. Let's just do all the shapes. And here I actually need to say something to you because you had a file way back when called a ball rig, which I used and I still use it.
What?
So if you recognize these expressions from your ball rig, you have these two nulls that you use to control the size of a sphere.
If I had known this, I would have demanded an animator credit on that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like you'll have to explain it better than me. Like I'm just interpreting here what you did.
That's so funny. Yeah, all it's doing, it's taking 2 points, it's calculating the distance between them and the rotation between them. And then it basically transforms your layer like to just always fit in between them. That brings a tear to my eye. Almost, that's awesome.
Yeah, but I just like the simplicity of yours. Like in a way, it's like you're controlling the rotation. So it's always pointing to the end. So I am rotating. So this controls the point. And then you're just defining how far or short you want it to go. And that, because it's a circle, it works wonderfully. And I believe your original rig had, like it would squash when you pulled it out. And I basically just deleted that line because I didn't want it to squash. And that's it. So that's something I've used many times. I know a lot of people have different ways and techniques of using this, but in order to create like this just per level of, like you don't have to worry about what I'm trying to say.
You want them to always touch and you want this one to shrink when this one grows, and that kind of the way you used it is pretty smart. It just does it automatically.
Yeah, exactly. So like what I wanted to do here is like, I just wanted to make sure that I can focus on the motion and not be troubleshooting on how this thing is going to work. Like I just want to make sure that I can control easily the scale of the circle so I can make sure that the movement feels right. That principle was for these 3 main circles. Now the 2 other shapes were not circles. I'll talk about the first one, which is just a cube. And this is fake 3D. Like I have a bunch of nulls in 3D space. Or actually, no. I have a bunch of nulls faking the 3D space. I'm just rotating them in a funny way. And I'm just matting each side. And for this one, I didn't even have to create the sides behind. Like, as you can see, I have the back, I have the 4 sides, and then I have the front. And the reason why I have those all is because I tried a bunch of animations, but at the end, I just needed this 3 sides. So in a way, it was totally useless that I created all this paths. And this is just a shape to path, a box connected with nulls. It's very, very basic to create that 3D feel.
So did you actually create a 3D box, or you created a rig that creates the illusion of a 3D box?
I created a rig that creates the illusion of a 3D box. So initially, I believe I had a 3D box in After Effects, but when I was scaling it, it was creating some funny stuff. And I can't remember why I decided to just go with shapes, but that's kind of why.
Yeah. Well, also too, I noticed you've kind of flattened the perspective on it, which can be tricky to do. So I was wondering if maybe that was way too.
Actually, I think that's what it was, because I have like an After Effects file that has a front view. So when I need to do this stuff, it works great. But it usually only works when the box is like one shade. But the moment that you scale them all like this, or you see a full front view, it starts creating some weird size on the side. Like the full frontal view of After Effects doesn't really exist. Like you need to fake it. So that's kind of why I did this. And then lastly, I literally just went to 3D, made a cone, and render it.
So you just faked all of the shading.
Yep. And then some of these reflections were from Cinema. Some of them were I just put on top. I just color them differently. So that's your base. And then I just made a mask for the middle part.
And just did that by hand.
Well, I did use the matte from the 3D, like a object buffer. But then this circle was just here in After Effects.
So this shot is really just a bunch. I mean, the one thing that I never would have guessed was the linear key trick, which that is a genius. But everything else is really just like really simple things. Just there's 100 of them and you put them all together and it looks super complicated.
So another little trick that I did is, so I have all my shape animation here, right? This is how they all look together. And it took surprisingly amount of variations to make this look right. So once I had this all moving properly, I wanted to have one master comp to control all that. So this circles and this cones, they are just referencing like copy property links basically. So that whatever I change in the shape master will change inside this solo cone layer. So I never animated this layer. This is purely to be able to animate them all together, but then be able to control them all individually when comping.
And was that so that any like sort of overall comping you did, effects and things like that wouldn't get messed up?
Yeah, I was particularly for the ones when there's overlapping. So this circle needs to reference the BG masters because it has 4 shades. So they all need to have the same base animation, but they need to look differently on each side.
Right, that makes sense. So the circle, as it passes through these different mats, also needs to have different textures and things on it. That makes sense. Yeah.
So that was basically the reason for it, just so that whenever this masking happens, I don't need to have an unlimited amount of pre-comps that I need to go through to make one change. Like if I change something in my shape master, say this, it changes.
Yeah, it updates downstream. Slick. Oh my God. 24 frames, all that work. All right, so Jorge, let's talk about the isometric shot. That one I really love because it just sort of jumps out as like this different style. And I thought it was cool how, one of the things I asked you guys to try was see if you can fit in all of these like motion designy sort of memes and things that you see. So how did you guys pull this shot off? And the motion looks really complicated. So I'm curious how you sort of got it all to work together.
Yeah, so again, this shot obviously was designed purely flat and Nuria did it. And when she did the isometric parts, she again used some references straight from Cinema, just like some boxes, but there was really no element in 3D that we could reuse from there. So we had to recreate a lot of that. And then there was like all these little characters that are completely flat. Some of them kind of had a bit of perspective, but we still had to make them all look like they were in this 3D plane. So one option would have been to do it entirely in 3D, but again, with the amount of textures and specialties and like each one shadow is unique and all these things, I was like, I think it makes more sense to kind of like treat each individual element as its own 3D world and then bring them all together into After Effects and truly combine it. So for the characters, they're really just 2D in After Effects, and Jose Peña did most of the characters. But then when we start introducing the 3D elements, if you like, even though they're all still technically flat. So if I show you the custom view, so the only thing that is 3D is the nulls. These nulls are just fully, I have a camera and I have a camera control, but at the end, all these nulls are just to show, like to define the position. So to explain it is, imagine the camera is here and then all these nulls will rotate accordingly.
And I'm assuming you're then using like 2comp expression to tie the 2D layer to the screen position of those nulls.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So even though none of the elements are 3D, I'm using all the 3D data to create that rotation. Because otherwise, the rotation, if I were to just do it flat, it would just be completely circular, and I wanted to have some kind of perspective.
Let me ask you this, because I assumed you did it this way, but the other way I think most people would assume to do it is to just use 3D layers, but have them auto-orient to camera.
So I did have that actually, but when it was 3D layers, I couldn't control the positioning of each, because a lot of the times, even though the null might be in front, the element in the design was behind, if that makes sense. Like, it didn't necessarily follow the rules of 3D space. So that's why I didn't do orient to come. Like, it just gave me more control to keep them flat. But the real trick in this shot, and it's something that I've done in a bunch of different shots, is I went ahead and in Cinema, let's focus on the book, for example. But I just went in Cinema and I modeled each of this, added my little animation, and just rendered 360 frames of what this looks like. And even though I'm missing the texture of the paper here, it's very basic render. So when I bring it into After Effects, this is my render. And then I use my shadow pass to make the shadow the color I want. And then I create some fake scatter shading to kind of like make it look like the style frame. And then at the end, I color the shadow the proper color. So this is 360 frames of just, you know, a paper stack. And I follow this for each one of them. So I textured them in Cinema 4D and I made them all rotate 360 degrees. And by the time it's time to put them here, this render, which is 360 frames, and I have them, okay, which null are you gonna follow? I just added a layer control, and you're gonna follow layer 78, which is my stack null. And this is just the null that moves from X to Y. And as you can see, because this follows the rotation, I can move this in any way I want. So one controls the rotation, one controls the position. And obviously, depending how close it is, how far it is, it keeps that isometric rotation. So that's the first part. It's like how I'm gonna control the position, and how I'm gonna control the rotation. Another one is how I'm gonna control those 360 frames that I rendered. And this is a little trick that I've used a lot of times. That Claudio helped me discover it years ago when we were interning at Buck. And I'm basically grabbing the time remap, dividing it by the amount of frames that I have, or frame rate that I have, so that's 24 frames. And then they create a little angle control, which is just an angle slider. I renamed it angle control. And then I add this little expression here saying, like, I'm just doing, and I don't even, you probably do a better job of explaining what percentage does. Because I just remember figuring out, I was like, okay, this works. I don't really know what it does. But the final result is that I can control each frame of the angle with an angle control, and that just shows which frame in that time map goes. And then it always repeats. So even if I'm like at 11 times here, like once it reaches 360, it goes back to 1 and so on. So this way I can control that rotation, I control the speed, and I can do whatever I want with it. And that's a trick, really. It's super simple.
Let me say a few things about that. First of all, I love that trick. And that trick's been around for a long time. I remember using it once on a project where we actually shot like little action figures on a turntable and did the exact same thing. But the way we did it was we would put an expression in time remap that would look at where the camera was and figure out the angle of that layer to the camera and then show the right frame so that you could actually have a fake kind of 3D thing in your scene. The way you did it is great because you can actually control it and kind of play with exactly the angle you want by having that angle control. So let me just try to sum this up for everybody watching. And I would suggest opening this project up and kind of picking it apart because there's a lot of little things happening with expressions that the expressions themselves aren't simple, but they're kind of layered. You've got 3D nulls in actual 3D space being spun around. You're using the 2comp expression, and if you look at the stack layer that Jorge's, that he was just showing us, that's a 2D layer. It's not actually a 3D layer. So it's not actually moving around in the 3D space. It's moving in 2D space, but it looks 3D because it's figuring out where is that null that I'm following on screen and go there. And so the illusion is that it's 3D. And then on top of that, you did this really cool trick of rendering 360 frames, which I was going to ask you why, but hopefully it's obvious. There's 360 degrees in a full rotation, and so it makes the math easier. Let me ask you this, Jorge, because one of the limitations of doing that is that sometimes you want things to turn a little slower, but you don't have enough frames. Did you run into that?
Yeah. So at the end of the computers, when everything slows down, that was a problem. So it was one of those things that I honestly ran out of time, but I was gonna go and render twice as many frames for that. So yeah, you can just increase the amount of frames in between. So the angle, say if I were to put 18.5, it would, or like 10.5, instead of gathering the frame 10, it would grab the frame, whatever, 15. So there's more frames in between each degree. So that's kind of you solve that problem, but it's not ideal.
Well, this shot, I love this shot because it's like visually, I mean, there's nothing simple about any shot in this piece, but as far as like, the piece goes, this is probably one of the more simple looking shots just because it's a little clearer. There's pieces and they're moving around in a circle. But even the way you've kind of set it up is cool because it's designed really to just give you total control over the frames, which, as you've mentioned, is very, very important to you. And I think there's one more shot that we were going to try to get to, which is the campfire shot. And that shot, when I saw it, I couldn't even guess how it was done. Parts of it I figured out, I think, but then some of it I was like, I don't even know. So why don't I stop talking and you just dive in, and what can we learn from that?
So this shot, the campfire shot, this was another one that we got help from freelancers. So that was Jordan Bergen. So he's been part of School of Motion. He's been doing some killer work. We worked with him in a couple projects. And as we were looking for freelancers and people that we wanted to we needed help to finish the project. We wanted someone that knew 3D well enough to build this shot, because the designs that Jay built were fully flat. He faked all the shading, but in summary, the shot is divided in three. We start on an outline world where all these people are around the campfire. Then each of them starts like, oh, I can learn 2D. And everybody was like, oh, I can learn 2D. So it's like, I'm not just at an outline, I have colors and I have fills. And then at the end, it's kind of like everybody becomes 3D. It's like, the idea is like this community, one learns, helps another, and then everybody grows together. And at the same time, it's like a little snippet of what the whole video is about. We're starting with outlines, we go into 2D, we go into 3D. So it's like a little summary of the whole piece in 7 seconds. So the way that Jordan approached it, because he knew that the end result was 3D, what he did was, let's start there. Instead of starting with a flat look, let's start with the end look, and then we work our way backwards. And I will show you what that looks like. We might be missing some heads here, but yeah, we're missing some heads. But here's the 3D render straight from Cinema. Like, there's the shading that he used is going to be pretty much the final shading, and tried to match as much as possible what Jay did in the style frame. But it's because we knew that it had to be 3D, we knew that we weren't going to be able to get that look so closely. And in this shot, it was a bit more forgiving, say, than the other shot with the totem pole, because it was like the colors were a lot simpler. It's not like there's a specific texture to each. It's more like we just want to show that they're 3D. So we didn't have to recolor every single body part to make it look exactly the same. Partly because Jay did it like that because he didn't want to get into Cinema. So if we can do it in Cinema to make it look 3D, let's just do that. So here, what he did is created really basic rigs for each. Like, once he modeled it, which if you look closely, is not an intense model. Like, you have like this very, very, very basic shapes, and then you have some limbs for the hands, and like the neck and the head is like just these very, very basic rigs. So this is not even connected to the neck.
Well, that's smart too, because I mean, there's so many characters in this shot. This could take an entire week to rig if you needed like total control over them or something. But again, it's just that like being economic with it.
And again, like the point of these is that their movement, like think about what it's gonna do. And in this case, they're just moving left to right and moving their hands. Like, you don't have to build a full rig that can do this and stretch and turn. Like, again, like it's basic parenting. Like, don't go into a rabbit hole of building an entire character if you know the movement doesn't require an entire character movement. It just requires some rotating limbs here and there. And then the rest is just brute force keyframing. Like, each one, make sure that each one kind of like moves in a funny way. First 1, 2, 3, 4. And then once you have this movement, it was a matter of duplicating this file, changing textures so that you can do the 2D one. So this is exact same movements, but just rendered differently.
Yeah. And now, do you know if was he using Sketch and Tune to do that?
Yeah. And then the first one is just the wireframes, which is also Sketch and Tune. So that's kind of it. Like, it's once you have the 3 of them, then you go and you create a very basic comping. But most of it was just making sure that it was well done in Cinema, that it was clean enough. Make sure you have one big movement ready, and then just duplicate that, and then you can start masking each character as needed. So first one of them happens, and then the next one, and then the next one. And then at the end, you have all of them wipe into the full 3D shot. Like, it's pretty smartly built, and it looks more complicated than it is, but it's really just 3 layers and then turning on and off the ones that you need.
What are some of the little things that are added? Like, I'm noticing little kind of energy lines, and there looks like there's some particles in there.
Yeah, so they really just particular in some ways. Like, it was just like little particles from the actual design files that we brought in to create some extra comping that were in the original designs, but those were added here in After Effects.
Now, let me ask you something about this. So this is really smartly built. And it's funny because now that I know how it was built, it's like, oh, of course, that is the smartest way to do it. In situations like this, how often does the animator just kind of figure it out and come up with that really clever way of building it so that you can basically do most of the work in comp once you've animated the characters? Did you have to help Jordan with that? Did he know how to do that? Or do you expect most animators to have that level of technical knowledge to be able to come up with the solution?
That's, I mean, to be honest, I don't actually remember. But as a general rule, I think, like, when we say assign a shot to an animator, we give some kind of direction and some kind of ideas of, oh, like, maybe it makes sense to build everything in 3D and then you just render 3 passes, and that's a way to do it. And like, that could be as long as the conversation goes. And sometimes they will have an idea. It was like, oh, like, were you thinking the characters are gonna have like crazy animations? Like, should we build this in, like, should we build the first section in After Effects? Like, it's just a little conversation, but it's mostly about letting the animator come up with a solution with just a little bit of direction that we've given. And in this case, someone like Jordan can be very proactive, and with very little direction or solutions, he can already visualize how this would make sense. But it's not something that like we intentionally look for in an animator. Like, it's more like we'll probably work with these people more often because we know that they can come up with solutions fast. But if they don't, then that's kind of where we're here. Like, we all bump into walls all the time. And sometimes you just gotta talk to somebody to come up with that solution.